Hello again, everybody. This is Mark Movsesian. I'm the director of the Mattone Center for Law and Religion at St. John's Law. And this is another episode of Legal Spirits, which is our podcast series on cases and issues in law and religion. You can find past episodes archived on our website, lawandreligionforum.org, and also at streaming platforms like Apple iTunes and Spotify. If you like this episode, please subscribe so that you can find out about new episodes as they are released. Well, the Mattone Center has a longstanding interest in international religious freedom. Over the years, we've hosted many events on the question, including a summit at the Vatican 10 years ago, at which Pope Francis gave the keynote. In this episode of Legal Spirits, we'll talk about the subject in the context of the human rights of Christians, specifically a group of Christians in the South Caucasus. Nagorno-Karabakh is a region where Armenian Christians have lived for many centuries. But Azerbaijan ethnically cleansed the region last year, following the second of two wars between Armenia and Azerbaijan, the first in the early 1990s and the second in the fall of 2020. As of today, no Armenian Christians remain in Karabakh, notwithstanding an order from the World Court, the International Court of Justice, that was meant to protect them, and a statement by the United States that it would not tolerate ethnic cleansing in the region. Azerbaijan has begun to destroy or repurpose many Armenian churches and monasteries in Karabakh, as it did earlier in a different region called Nakhichevan, and it's not clear how long any remnant of the centuries-old Armenian Christian community will remain there. Our guest today will discuss the ethnic cleansing of Armenian Christians in Karabakh and why the international human rights regime, sadly, has proven unable to prevent it. Karnig Kerkonian is a distinguished lawyer with Kerkonian Dajani LLP and international law firms with offices in Chicago, Los Angeles, and Armenia. In addition to maintaining a substantial private practice, Karnig has represented both the Republic of Armenia and the Armenian Apostolic Church in international and regional human rights tribunals. For example, he's counsel in the case of Armenian Apostolic Church versus the Republic of Azerbaijan at the European Court of Human Rights regarding violations of the European Convention of Human Rights against Armenians during and after the Second Karabakh War in 2020. And Karnig, I'll be asking you about the status of that case. And Karnig was a member of the team representing Armenia in an action against Azerbaijan at the ICJ in 2021, in which Armenia successfully sued for violations of the International Anti-Racism Convention. The ICJ ordered Azerbaijan to end its blockade of Karabakh and protect Armenian churches and other places of worship, but Azerbaijan has ignored that ruling. Now, Karnig has his undergraduate degree from Harvard and his JD from the University of Chicago and a graduate degree from Cambridge. He's spoken at U.S. congressional hearings, in the European Parliament, at leading universities and law schools, and of course now, Legal Spirits. His writings have appeared in numerous international media sources and mainstream publications. So welcome to Legal Spirits, Karnig.
Thank you for having me, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Karnig, many of our listeners are probably unfamiliar with the details of the Karabakh conflict. So I'd like to begin by asking you, please, to fill us in on the history of that conflict, including the ethnic cleansing that took place a year ago in September 2023. So get us up to date. What's happened since then?
Yeah, sure. I think you alluded earlier to the Armenian Christian presence in Nagorno-Karabakh. That is dated to the earliest times of Armenia's acceptance of Christianity in 301. Some of the most fundamental places and important spaces of Armenian Christian heritage are in Nagorno-Karabakh, including Amaras, which is where Mesrop Mashtots, the creator of the Armenian alphabet, taught his first classes in which they translated the Bible into Armenian Karapad, which is the ancient and biblical Armenian classical language. But the history of Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh actually dates further back. There's been an Armenian presence in Nagorno-Karabakh since for at least 4,000 years. The evidence on the ground establishes that. So for as long as Armenians have lived there as Christians, they have lived there prior to Christianity. And I think that's an important point to take into consideration. And throughout those centuries, Armenians have lived with a significant amount of self-rule and autonomy in Nagorno-Karabakh, whether it has been under Persian domination, Russian domination, whether it has been under Armenian tutelage. There has always been, the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh have always had autonomy to varying degrees, given the basis of what the global world order was at the time. What happened, and I think what's relevant to kind of bring us up to 2023, was that at the fall of the Soviet Union, many people believe that one of the main immediate cause or catalysts, in addition to the earthquake in Armenia, kind of busting down the Iron Curtain, was the Artsakh Armenians' call for unification with Armenia. And I say this because up until at the creation of the Soviet Union, Nagorno-Karabakh, Stalin had put Nagorno-Karabakh, this region, which means mountainous region, within the administrative control of the Azerbaijani SSR, so the Azerbaijani Soviet Socialist Republic. Obviously, that was part of Stalin's divide and conquer policies with respect to nationalities and religions in the South Caucasus and elsewhere. And what happened and what we saw there is this subjugation of Armenians within the Azerbaijani Soviet Socialist Republic. Now, the ultimate power, of course, was not an independent Azerbaijani state at the time, but was the Soviet Union. And so let's fast forward to the fall of the Soviet Union. When Azerbaijan seceded from the Soviet Union, the Soviet constitution had pretty clear guidelines with respect to how autonomous regions or administrative regions within that Soviet Socialist Republic could then take actions. They could remain with the Soviet Union directly. They could go with the seceding Soviet Socialist Republic, or they can declare their independence and move forward otherwise, which is what the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh did. So it's an important point to remember that Nagorno-Karabakh has never been, the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh have never been under the control of a independent Azerbaijani state. And that's going to be really important to think about when we get into some of the other issues regarding ethnic and religious tensions with respect to the Azerbaijanis' treatment of Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians.
That's very important that you clarified that. And so take us up to the 1990s. So the Soviet Union breaks up and there's conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh.
Yes, there's conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, and the Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians seek unification with their kin, many of whom have families in Armenia and in Nagorno-Karabakh at the same time, and seek unification. That leads to a war.
Unification with Armenia, Karnig.
Correct. Unification with Armenia. So Nagorno-Karabakh expresses its desires under the Soviet constitution when Azerbaijan broke away to say, we want to unify with our Armenian brothers in neighboring Armenia. And what happened was a war broke out, a bloody war that ended finally in a ceasefire in 1994 that left Armenians in control of Nagorno-Karabakh in a ceasefire agreement that was signed by Azerbaijan, signed by Armenia, and signed by the government of Nagorno-Karabakh. And what transpired over the next 27 years was a relatively stable environment in the South Caucasus with respect to this issue, where Armenians had a democratic republic created in Nagorno-Karabakh, governing their affairs in autonomous fashion, without any oversight or without any influence by Baku. And that relative peace remained until very recently, until 2020. Now, there were some attacks by Azerbaijan seeking to take territorial control over Nagorno-Karabakh in 2016 and threats throughout the period. but there was an international mechanism set up by the OSCE and allowed for peace negotiations. And one of the issues was with respect to a final status of Nagorno-Karabakh was that it would be negotiated and determined by peaceful means. That all changed in September 2020 when Azerbaijan launched a full-out attack on Nagorno-Karabakh and succeeded in a 44-day war in taking much of the Republic of Artsak's territory, leaving a certain portion, a smaller portion around Stepanaket, which is the capital of Nagorno-Karabakh, under the control of Armenians. And what happened at that time is that the ceasefire that was brokered at the end of that 44-day war was brokered by Russia, who, interestingly enough, came in to protect the Armenians that were there, that remained. And in its initiating papers, it's clear that they came in there to protect, and it states that from the destruction of the Nagorno, to save Armenians from destruction by Azerbaijan. So that's a very important role. And that period then, call it the Russian protectorate of the northern portion of Nagorno-Karabakh, lasted until a blockade approximately a year ago. That began, in which Azerbaijan proceeded to take military actions incrementally, one of which was the complete isolation of Nagorno-Karabakh and cutting of all transport routes, and seeking to starve the Artsakh Armenians into submission, and essentially take over the area by force. And that's what led to the ethnic cleansing, which I'm sure we'll get into momentarily.
Well, that's the next thing I was going to say. So that's about a year ago now. That's September 2023, in which the ethnic cleansing actually took place.
Yes, September 2023, September 19th, there was another military attack. Now, you have to realize Armenians at that point, the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh, had been surrounded by the Azerbaijani military, had been starved for over 9 months, no medical supplies. The Red Cross had limited and then no access, which is really important to take into consideration. No medicines, surgeries weren't being able to be performed, and then they attacked militarily. Gas and electricity had been cut for months. The situation was extremely devastating, and the attacks on September 19th then essentially led to a choice for the Artsakh Armenians: death or displacement. And what we saw was the forced removal of the Armenians, of 120,000 Armenians, from Nagorno-Karabakh through an area called the Lachin Corridor. And I'm sure we'll come back to that specific piece of land because it's relevant to the International Court of Justice orders, and what was supposed to happen in Nagorno-Karabakh following.
Yeah. So I just want to alert our listeners, you've mentioned the word Artsakh a couple of times, and that is what Armenians call it. The world outside tends to know it as Karabakh, which is why I've been using that phrase, but Artsakh is the word that Armenians would use. Okay, that's the background of the conflict. So could you tell us about the international law issues here? And let's focus first on this action in the International Court of Justice, or ICJ, in which you helped to represent Armenia. So could you please tell us about that? What international law obligations did Azerbaijan violate, and what effect did the ICJ ruling have on the conflict?
Those are great questions, Mark. I think to begin with, in a general sense, the international law obligations that Azerbaijan violated were the obligations that Azerbaijan voluntarily undertook. And I think that's really important to realize. This is not some general, the rules that were violated were not some general ideas of what we would understand as common law or the customary international law. But these are actual treaty obligations that Azerbaijan undertook to join the civilized society of states, one of which was not to dehumanize and discriminate against individuals and peoples on the basis of their ethnic, religious, racial backgrounds and what have you. And that's enshrined in the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which is the actual treaty obligations under which the action at the ICJ was brought. So Armenia brought an action in the aftermath of the 2020 war because what the evidence had shown was that there was an increasing buildup of dehumanizing rhetoric, actions by the Azerbaijani state to act upon the uh, the initiatives that rhetoric espoused. And I'm going to bring up one quick example, which I think kind of sums this up. They say a picture speaks 1,000 words. Azerbaijan, in 2020, issued a stamp, a public stamp, a state stamp, that depicted an exterminator in a hazmat suit, actually cleansing Nagorno-Karabakh with chemicals. That postage stamp wasn't actually published by accepted by the International Postal Union, but it shows something really interesting, and we can come back to in the aftermath of the ethnic cleansing what that image has transponded to in current time. So that is really important to kind of understand with respect to the ICJ case, because what we have here is racial discrimination and the racial, ethnic, and religious discrimination. And the reason why this convention exists is that it is a stopgap measure to genocide. In other words, if we can stop the hatred and the rhetoric and the dehumanization and the objectification and subjugation of people by a government, then perhaps we can actually nip these types of genocidal acts in the bud. And this is what the basis of the case is at the ICJ.
Which Armenia prevailed in, correct? I mean, there was an order from the ICJ that Azerbaijan had to stop doing these things, and as we all know, that didn't happen.
Correct. There were interim provisional measures. The case is still pending. It's important to note for final decision on the merits. But as it stands right now, the orders that have come down from the ICJ, some of the elements being some of the elements of the orders being unanimous, others 13-1, 13-2 or 14-1, essentially said that the Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians are being that there is dehumanization and racial rhetoric that needs to stop. Of course, it never did, and we can get to that in a moment. But there's also some really important kind of geopolitical statements that were made by the court. And one is that the Lachin corridor, which I spoke to earlier, which is the road, the corridor that links Nagorno-Karabakh to Armenia proper, was supposed to be opened and remain open in both directions. That was violated openly by Azerbaijan when it actually set up military posts on that road, and then proceeded to isolate and then starve Armenians from receiving any supplies from Armenia, which led and precipitated to the fateful events of September 2023, when the Armenians were ethnically cleansed.
Yeah, so briefly, the ICJ has issued these interim orders. The case is still pending, and the orders included keeping open the Lachin corridor, which obviously didn't happen. As you've explained, the ethnic Armenian population of Karabakh was basically expelled in September 2023 in violation of these interim rulings. And I have to say, as someone who's taught international law, including international human rights law, I have to say that this episode really justifies skepticism about the whole system. You can't have law without an enforcement mechanism, and the enforcement mechanism when it comes to ICJ rulings lies in the Security Council. And no one thinks the Security Council would enforce this ruling, notwithstanding the fact that some Security Council members, including the US, have said ethnic cleansing in Karabakh is intolerable. So I just wonder, how would you, as an international human rights lawyer, respond to the criticism that, well, this just shows the episode just shows that the international human rights regime is sort of, basically ineffective in what it's supposed to do?
Yeah, I think that's a question, of course, that almost every international lawyer gets, especially practicing international lawyers. What's the value in this? This is a futile endeavor. Why should actions be taken like this? I can explain that in a couple of ways. I think the most important point to highlight is that and you're completely correct about the enforcement mechanism that is generally and often at play in ICJ orders and other international tribunals. Um, but I think when an international lawyer looks at the law, we have to look at it in the context of that moment in history. And it's important to document. It's one thing to say things, right? To say that these people's rights are being violated, these people's rights are being trampled upon. Those are intangible claims. What International Court of Justice and other international tribunals measures do in one capacity is to make intangible claims tangible, in that you have a paper order that says this needs to happen. Now, in order for those to be acted upon, it goes more than just ICJ enforcement mechanism. Yes, ICJ enforcement mechanisms. ICJ orders also have some diplomatic value, and I think that that's really important to understand, because it's very hard to put an ICJ order on the table and then and then negotiate the actual terms of that, to say, well, yes, the ICJ has ruled that the election corridor should be open, but we're not going to agree to that. There is a fundamental difficulty in overcoming that in a negotiation. And so I think that's important in terms of the peaceful resolution of disputes. So it actually has value, taking claims that are intangible, making them tangible, so that they can then be advocated, whether in diplomatic or political circles. So there is value in that regard. The other thing is, there is, international legal opinions are what future actions by states are built upon. And it's a way of reducing arguments and evidence, and presenting it to an impartial panel, who then makes a decision upon which other decisions can happen later. For example, if there is a time in the future where the rights and privileges of the Artsakh Armenians, the Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians, is to be discussed, is to be decided, the decisions of the International Court of Justice are fundamental to informing those discussions. The problem, of course, is that when you have a situation where military conquest or military actions are dictating the global agenda, obviously it's very easy for people to be skeptical. International Court of Justice orders have a very relevant role in the peaceful resolution of disputes, not only in that dispute, but then to take those orders and apply them to the geopolitical changes that are happening throughout the world. So I think that there's a lot of value in establishing, in a tangible sense, what those rules are, what the outcome of what an impartial court would say on these issues. I push back a little bit on the value of this. And then the other aspect is, there is no question that military and political might has value in this current world global situation that we're in. But so does the expression of sovereignty. And I think that that's really one of the other elements of the ICJ in particular that's important, is that it's an expression of sovereignty by states that would otherwise find themselves in a place where they wouldn't be able to advocate in that regard.
Okay, well, Karnig, that's a very eloquent answer. I'm not sure you persuaded me, but that is an eloquent answer about the value of international law. And you have also represented the Armenian Apostolic Church in an action against Azerbaijan at the European Court of Human Rights. Now, European Court of Human Rights, for our listeners, that's a regional tribunal, not an international or global tribunal. And so arguably the chances of success will be a little bit higher at a regional tribunal. So could you please tell us about that lawsuit? So what's going on there, and where does that lawsuit stand?
So in the European Court of Human Rights, under the European Convention of Human Rights, there are guarantees with respect to the practice of religious rights. And the case that was brought by the Armenian Apostolic Church against Azerbaijan was based on the obstruction of those rights by Azerbaijan in the aftermath of the 2020 war. And this is really important, because when I talk about the nature of the case currently, which is still pending, what it talks about is the ability of parishioners and Christians under the guidance of their church to actually worship at the places that were taken over and subsequently, many of them destroyed by Azerbaijan, converted into mosques, culturally appropriated, and argued that these are not Armenian churches. And in fact, they are Albanian churches. So there are significant dimensions to this case that are really important with respect to religious rights and the rights of Christian Armenians to practice in these churches. The case remains pending. The stage that it's at right now is that in the aftermath of the ethnic cleansing of Nagorno-Karabakh, the claims, the evidentiary basis for the claims have only significantly skyrocketed. There have been numerous instances of further destruction of Armenian Christian sites, Christian heritage sites, and now the complete prohibition of Armenians from being able to exercise those rights in Nagorno-Karabakh, visit their cemeteries, their baptismal founts, and what have you. And what we have seen over and over again is that the evidence that feeds these cases, Mark, really underlines something that is really critical, that is going to be an element of discussions on this issue in the South Caucasus. And that involves the genocidal intent exhibited by Ilham Aliyev, the president of Azerbaijan, I should say the hereditary president of Azerbaijan, whose wife is the vice president of Azerbaijan, whose father was president prior to him. So all of these, kind of going back to the ICJ, the value is that when you have these facts that are established in the record, you then can build on them. And what we've realized over and over again is that the rhetoric and the actions taken by the Azerbaijani state with respect to the Artsakh Armenians reflects an intent to destroy. And that is really important, obviously, under the Genocide Convention, which defines genocide in Article 2 in that particular language, that the goal has been to destroy the Artsakh Armenians. And what's really frightening, I think, in terms of the geopolitics of the region, is to realize that Nagorno-Karabakh is essentially Ilham Aliyev's Sudetenland. He openly calls Armenia today, Armenia proper, Western Azerbaijan. And so his territorial conquests are not done. And these cases that establish the fact that, hey, look, Armenian Christian rights are being impacted, Armenian churches are being converted, Armenian cemeteries are being openly destroyed, which is something you hearkened earlier to Nakhichevan, another region historically populated by Armenians that was given to Azerbaijan under administrative control, in which evidence surfaced from satellites showing that there were bulldozers taking down Armenian cemeteries and heritage sites. So there is a plan and successive acts that demonstrate that intent, Mark.
Well, of course, we don't have time to get into it in this podcast, but you should also, I think, see the whole conflict now as kind of a continuation of the conflict at the end of the Ottoman Empire, the Armenian genocide of 1915. I mean, there are clear parallels, and indeed, President Erdogan of Turkey actually said that we are completing the mission of our grandfathers in the Caucasus. We don't have time for that, unfortunately, but that's maybe another podcast. We can talk about all of that. I do want to talk about this issue, though, before we close, and that is the role of religion in this whole conflict. Armenians are Christians, the Azeris are Muslim, and there's obviously some religious element here, although it's a complicated thing, right? And someone might say, well, even though Armenians are Christians and Azeris are Muslim, this is really not what this conflict is about. It's about other things like nationalism, or you mentioned a second ago the imperial politics of Azerbaijan, or the imperial politics of Russia. And I mean, I look at it and I think, well, this is kind of a combination of a lot of these factors. I don't think it's fair to say religion has nothing to do with it, but there are a lot of other factors involved here too, as there always are in conflicts of this nature. I just want to give you a chance to comment on that.
Yeah, I don't think that the role of religion can be ignored in this conflict, but it doesn't show up in a traditional sense. These aren't in the sense of jihad, and there's a disclaimer there, and I will bring that up in a second. But there is an exploitation and use of religion as defining the Artsakh Armenians as the other. That is absolutely clear. There is no question about that. but also in terms of methods and methods of mobilization of it takes a lot to motivate people to commit some of the atrocities that we've seen, which are extremely heinous, which are reminiscent not only of ISIS type beheadings and actions like that, but it's an open reality now that that Turkey and Azerbaijan recruited fighters from northern Syria on the basis of religious mobilization and an opportunity to kill Christians. In fact, there were bounties put on Armenian heads, $200 per head, and things of that nature. So mercenaries that were brought in from the conflict in northern Syria were motivated by religious hatred. They had no other reason to hate the Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians and had no interaction with them. So religion does play a role in that respect, but it also plays a role in redefining the character of the land as well. And I say that because Armenian cultural and religious heritage stands as a stark reminder for conquesting parties that Armenian Christians are here. This is so it plays a very important role with respect to the evidentiary basis of a lot of these cases to demonstrate that, well, hold on a second, this can't be Azerbaijani. Armenians have had to have lived here because they have churches here that have Armenian script on them in the tradition of Armenian Christianity. So it doesn't show up in the ways that one would necessarily think. In other words, is the intent of Ilham Aliyev to create an Islamic empire in the South Caucasus? I think that's a stretch. But is it the intent to remove Armenians and any signs, which in a large degree are signs are Christian elements and aspects of the Armenian people from the region? Yes, because it helps him reinforce the narrative that this land is in fact his, is in fact the belongs to the Muslim population there, the Azerbaijani population, and does not belong to the Christian Armenians. So the South Caucasus is one of the places where those brackish waters exist. This is a front line in many ways, but not in the traditional ways one would think the sides aligning for religious conquest.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way to put it. And I think for American listeners, you need to understand that religion is a complicated thing. It's not always, simply a kind of a conflict involving belief or transcendence or something like that. These are also communal things. And so, well, as I said before, I think it's wrong to say this is a religious conflict per se, but it's also wrong to say that religion simply is not involved in this. And I think it's important for listeners to understand the complexities of that. Well, Karnig, we're out of time, but thank you so much for coming on Legal Spirits. We're going to bring you back to discuss this and related matters again, especially as you've pointed out, these cases are ongoing. And so let's see how they all develop. I'm particularly interested in the one in the European court. I'm a little more hopeful about that than about the World Court, but I take your answers as pointing to perhaps some usefulness here that maybe I'm not seeing right now about these other judgments, and we'll just have to wait and see. So thank you very much, Karnig. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I think just in closing, I think that's kind of what's really important. It kind of is a segue from the International Court of Justice orders, European court orders, is that it establishes kind of an interesting reality. We're dealing with alternative narratives. We're dealing with in Azerbaijan an authoritarian state that is essentially trying to create a narrative of its place in the region. One of the most significant acts of that is its hosting of the COP29 conference coming up. And when you have a state hosting a UN conference, that is an open violation of international court orders. Yes, to one extent, it's about skepticism. To the other extent, it opens the opportunities for conversations. And that's why I kind of harken back to the role that these orders play in diplomatic talks and negotiations. But it takes actual effort to put these issues on the table, which doesn't fall into the auspices of lawyers, but falls into the auspices of diplomats, those at international institutions, and politicians. So I think it's one of the elements. I think it feeds the discussions and resolutions of issues. It by itself is not going to solve anything, as we have seen not only in this conflict but conflicts throughout the world.
Well, perhaps that's a good place to leave it, Karnig. Thank you very much for coming on and discussing these very important issues with us. Listeners, we'll be back for another Legal Spirits episode next month. If you like these episodes, please consider subscribing so you can find out as episodes become available. And we'll see you next time. But that's it for now.